The text I am talking about today is Bao Chang's Lives of the Nuns, which was composed about 516 and contains biographies of 65 women who joined the Buddhist order of nuns in China in the 4th and 5th centuries. Apologies in advance for my pronunciation, I'm not good at this. And before we begin, Isa's going to interject to say a little bit about what we're doing with transliteration.
There are lots of ways of transliterating Chinese script for English-speaking academics. The two main systems used in academia are called Weijiaos and Pinyin. Weijiaos is the older of the two systems and was in widespread use until a few decades ago. Pinyin began to replace it in academia in the 1980s. For example, Anne Hireman has written several relevant articles for the episode today. Her discussion of Chinese nuns in 2001 uses Weijiaos, but in 2011, when she wrote about the ordination of nuns, she used Pinyin. Fortunately, Hireman is an excellent scholar, so she includes Chinese characters as well. These are the title of the work we are looking at today, and the name of the author, and two of the transliterations you will find in the literature. The top is the older, and is the version used in our main translation of the Lives of the Nuns by Catherine Tai. The ones at the bottom are what you will usually see in recent articles talking about the lives of the nuns. Robert tells me students often don't recognize these are the same things. And he told me that he didn't realize the first part of the title was itself a Chinese transliteration of the Indian term bhikshuni until he saw the Pinyin transliteration. Anyway, in this episode, we are not going to try and standardize because that is not how you will experience this if you read about it. We'll quote the transliteration people use, and that will be mostly Weijiaos.
The Lives of the Nuns begins with a short introduction addressing the importance of the nuns as moral exemplars and referring to the foundation of the order of nuns in China. It says, when, during the second age of the Buddhist religion, which began 500 years after the death of the Buddha, the faith spread east to China, the nun Ching-chien became the first, and for several hundred years, nuns of great virtue appeared in China, one after another. Ching-chien's is the first biography. Like most Chinese nuns, this is an adopted name. In full, it means pure example of an Indian teacher. That first element, Ju, commonly used by early nuns, indicates the origin of the teacher, in this case, India. When young Ching-chien began to visit a monk and asked him, in the scriptures it says bhikshu and bhikshuni aspire to deliverance. Fa Shi replied, in the western regions there are two monastic assemblies, that of bhikshu or monks for men and that of bhikshuni or nuns for women. But in this country the books or rules for the monastic life are not complete. Though the text says the rules for nuns were missing, Ching-chien founded the Grove Convent in Luoyang and established a community of women who cast off secular garb and accepted the 10 fundamental precepts from the instructor. Which raises an interesting question. Are these nuns? If a woman starts practicing as a Buddhist nun, does she become a Buddhist nun? Or do you need some kind of formal ordination, a particular procedure or ceremony in order to become a nun? I am aware that the status of women, particularly what a woman has to do to become a nun, is a live topic for Buddhists today. And I have opinions on that, and they mostly boil down to I don't see why any woman who wants to become a nun shouldn't become a nun. But they are just opinions. I have no expertise in modern Buddhist practice. This is a channel about history. And I am interested in what this text tells us about what people thought between the 4th and the 6th century in China. And I know, even though I say that there's almost no way that you can listen to what I'm about to say and not read it as a commentary on modern debates, if those are debates you are aware of. And yeah, that's inevitable. All I can tell you is that's not what I intend it to be. The answer that the Lives appears to give to this question, what it is a woman needs to do to become a nun, in the first biography, is that being a nun is a matter of adhering to certain specific rules, and therefore the problem, the obstacle, is the lack of those rules, of an accurate Vinaya text. A problem not overcome until some 40 years later, when a copy was acquired, probably from Kashmir, in 357. The translation of the text was completed in Luoyang on the 8th day of the 2nd month. The foreign Buddhist monk, Tan Mo-je, set up a ceremonial dais, on which Ching-chien and her disciples were to accept all of the monastic rules for women as found in the newly translated text. However, this ordination was not without controversy. A Chinese monk objected to this action on the basis of scriptures on the origins of monastic rules that said, because there was no assembly of nuns in China to bestow the rules on the women as the scriptures required, the ritual should not be carried out. A quick aside on the value of having multiple translations of the same text. I suspect Tsai of allowing a layer of exegesis into this translation. The other two translations imply that the text does not specify precisely what the objection was, simply which text was cited in support of that objection. Given what we're going to hear in a moment, that it related to a lack of an order of nuns is a reasonable guess, but it is a guess. The main point is that Baoshang acknowledges that disagreement might exist about what is necessary for someone to become a nun, a point that is going to come up again in later biographies. For now, I want to digress on the issue of chronology. The second biography in the lives of the nuns is the biography of Anjin Shou, who established the founding of Wisdom Convent. The text says that the convent was founded before 349, at least 8 years before Ching-chien was ordained. But Anjin Shou is said to be ordained by Ching-chien. So what exactly does ordained mean in this circumstance? A similar issue comes up with the third biography, where we read, when Fu Jian took the throne of the non-Chinese dynasty of the former Qin in 351, he heard of her reputation and showed great respect. He had made for her finely embroidered outer robes, which implies Zhu Xian was a nun at least 6 years before Ching-chien was ordained. And the same is true in the fourth biography. During the Yung-Ho period of the Qin dynasty, the administrator of Hong-an Commandery requested her to carry out a 7-day vegetarian religious fast, which implies that the nun in question was operating as such at least a year before Ching-chien was ordained. Were there nuns in China before Ching-chien? Perhaps these women were renunciants, like Ching-chien, but they weren't formally ordained until after she was. Or perhaps the dates are wrong. We'll see some issues in general with the dates in the lives. In any case, the lives does not directly credit any of these women with priority, at least not until the fifth biography. The story of Can Ming Can has some substantial legendary elements. She's kidnapped twice, guided home by a tiger, and so on. But she does eventually become a nun and travels south to the capital, where the Minister of Public Works offers to establish a convent for her. He asked Mingan, what should the convent be named? She replied, in the great realm of the Qin dynasty, all the 4 Buddhist assemblies of monks, nuns, and male and female householders are now established for the first time. Furthermore, that which you as donor have established will bestow blessings and merit. Therefore, let us call the convent Established Blessings Convent. The text of the story here is explicit. Before this moment, there was no order of nuns in China. There were women who renounced, but there were no nuns. The date of this event is a little unclear. As Sign notes, this biography is paired with the 7th of Wei Zhan, and the two give different dates for their journeys together. But both of those dates are earlier than Ching-chien's ordination, and in any case, there is that explicit claim to priority. It's an interesting question. Why, if the compiler of the text thought Ching-chien was the first nun, he did not either gloss or edit out Ming-gan's rival claim? Because by the standards I would imagine applying, Ming-gan is surely the first nun in China. Well, yeah, but there is more. The related biographies of Tam Bei and Songji both give earlier dates. Tam Bei was ordained in the 340s. Apparently she just wasn't up for being married and her mother agreed to her becoming a nun instead. And Songji founded a monastery in the same city in 344. Again, Tsai notes the dates don't really make sense. If the story is right about the age of the nun, it cannot be right about the date of the convent, and vice versa. The biography of Dao Rong of New Grove Convent gives an even earlier date, in the reign of the Emperor Ming of Qin. That's in the 320s, a priority of at least 30 years. Though here, I think we should suspect a pious fabrication. Though again, we should ask the question, why Bao Chang doesn't either editorialise or omit the pious fabrication. This is one of those problems you'd need a lot of work to get to grips with. We could really do with a critical edition comparing textual variants and systematically collecting other references to these nuns. Then you might get a sense of whether these are just copyists' mistakes in the version we have, which, to be clear, is much later than the original composition, or that there were contradictory versions of the stories circulating when Bao Chang compiled them. Because Bao Chang seems to be aware of and concerned with the problem of dates. Discussing the foundation of a monastery, he writes, I, the biographer, was told by my fellow monk that it was the 7th year, but the abbess of Luminous Blessing Convent, the nun Hong An, let me see the land deed, which shows the date to be the 3rd year. Leaving open the question of why Bao Chang doesn't try to hide the messiness and competing claims to priority, we could ask why they exist at all. One clear feature of the first 10 biographies is that they are about different lineages of nuns and convents, mostly convents the biographer has no direct contact with. My intuition is that the women began practicing as nuns independently of each other in a number of different places in the early to mid 4th century, and that when the order subsequently expanded, that left a lot of competing convents with rival claims to priority. Wang Wen-yi argues that expansion resulted from political and social instability, which would likely have further exacerbated this problem. Though Bao Chang glosses Ching-chien as the first nun, by preserving the traditions of rival lineages, he shows us that the foundation of the nuns' order was not a singular event in China, but multiple events that took place within complicated social processes and were often contested. And these contests become explicit in biography 14. Wei Guo's is the first of a complicated set of biographies from convents we know Bao Chang had direct contact with. There are 19 of these in the collection, and they are all connected together by 3 foreign monastics, the Indian monks Sangavarman and Gunavarman, and the Sri Lankan nun Tessara. These are the 3 in the centre of the chart, marked in orange. Grey boxes represent nuns whose biography is preserved in the lives, and the white boxes nuns the lives mentions but does not give a biography for. The debate preserved in these biographies comes back to the question of what makes a nun a nun. Does she have to behave like a nun? In which case, remember, from Ching-chien's story, the critical thing is having a set of rules. Or is the important thing formal ordination, the ceremony a nun goes through? In Wei Guo's biography, she is said to have asked several questions of Gunavarman about the validity of ordaining nuns under different circumstances, particularly without other nuns present. 2 defences of the practice are presented: that the rules are relaxed in frontier regions, and that the very first nun, Mahaprajapati, was not ordained by an existing order of nuns. Interestingly, the text at several points reaffirms that these are sound reasoning in Buddhist context. It seems likely it was reasoning the compiler agreed with, but it suggests that this was not a universally held opinion. In the biography of Song Guo, in 429, the question is placed in the mouths of a group of visiting Sri Lankan nuns. Not long after taking up residence there, they asked Song Guo, "Before we came to this country, had foreign nuns ever been here?" In this text, the answer is no, and the implication is that the previous ordinations weren't really valid because there should have been nuns present. Wei Guo asks the obvious question of Gunavarman. Is it possible that formerly, when there were as yet no nuns in China, there were certainly some in India? Which is a perfectly reasonable question, essentially trying to establish if it was possible for Indian nuns to have facilitated the earlier ordinations. Frustratingly, the text does not answer this question, and we don't know if there was an order of nuns in Kashmir in the 4th century, and thus whether acquiring a Vinaya text was the only option or was a choice. Anyway, the remedy the story comes to is that if you get enough Sri Lankan nuns, you can dot the I's and cross the T's on the whole ordination business. In the 10th year, Nanti, the ship captain, brought 11 more nuns from Sri Lanka, including one named Tessara. The first group of nuns, who by this time had become fluent in Chinese, requested the Indian missionary monk Sangavarman to preside over the ritual for bestowing the monastic rules on women at the ceremonial platform in Southern Grove Monastery. That day, more than 300 women accepted once again the full monastic obligation. The text is explicit at this point that this was not strictly necessary for an order of nuns to exist. In the biography of Bo Xian, it is written, Gunavarman had not said that the first transmission to China from the assembly of monks only was invalid. He had said rather that the second transmission, that included the assembly of nuns, was augmenting the good value of the obligation that had already been received. But it is clear that this is effectively another foundation story, another account of how the order of nuns arrived in China, which by now has traced their origins to Sogdia, the Tarim Basin, northwest India, Sri Lanka, and to both the South Asian order of monks and order of nuns. Between them, they cover every possible base, but they also rather confuse the issue of who was first and what criteria it is being measured by. It would make logical sense to me, and I presume to most of my audience, that if you are not going to arrange the monastics by their lineage, which the Lives does not, then the obvious alternative is the date of their ordination. And the text does treat ordination, the moment when each woman formally becomes a nun, as a pivotal moment in their biography. But Bao Chang does not arrange it this way. It is immediately obvious, as we just saw, that the nuns are not organised in the order in which they became nuns, in which they were formally ordained. Casually reading, I initially thought they might be organised by age. Older women might be placed earlier, and that sort of makes sense given that when women became nuns in their lives could vary a lot. Most of the biographies, which of course are not a representative sample, the women become nuns between the ages of 17 and 21, but a significant number become nuns as children around 8 years old, and some, which includes Ching-chien, are quite elderly when they become nuns. And of the women whose date of birth can be calculated from the text, Ching-chien is the oldest, and she's the only one who was born in the 3rd century. But no, though the text does make more sense when organised in that way, there's far too many discrepancies for that to be the organising principle. None of this is helped by the tendency for dates to not quite line up or make sense, as we've already noted in the various stories, and the lack of certainty as to whether and to what extent that is inconsistencies in Bao Chang's source material or textual corruption. However, in looking at the dates that do occur, a pattern does begin to jump out, and it reflects a much more mundane organising procedure: the date at which the subject of the biography died. It is not 100% consistent. There are a few biographies which are out of place by very small amounts, but not only is the date of the nun's death reported much more consistently than other dates, it usually matches the order in which the biographies are presented. And that makes a lot of practical sense if you are compiling obituaries. And at least for the later biographies, I think we can be reasonably confident that is what Bao Chang is doing. In an article entitled A Niche of Their Own, Wendy Adamak translates 2 inscriptions written about 100 years after the Lives, part of a group of 37 mid-7th century inscriptions relating to 2 convents. Both are obituaries engraved by followers and students, and as Adamek illustrates, they are structurally very similar to the later biographies in the lives, which suggests that both the inscriptions and the lives drew on a common tradition of recording obituaries, which of course, much like the lives, would consistently record the date on which the nun died. And which nun died first? Well, Ching-chien, by about 30 years. So does Baochang's gloss that she is the first nun in China rest on nothing more than the convenience of compilation?
Which is all great, and pretty much where the preparation for this episode had got to last year. Except that we know why Ching-chien is considered the first nun. She was the first person to take novice vows in China. Catherine Tai wrote an article in 1981 talking about the Chinese Order of Nuns, that the first recorded Chinese nun received ordination in 317. Zhong Ningyi of Pengcheng, whose religious name was Ching-chien, took only the 10 vows of a novice at the time, not receiving full ordination until 357, a few years at most before her death at age 70. Other Chinese women were fully ordained nuns prior to that year, but Ching-chien is called the first because of her novice vows. So that is that, or so we thought when I read the article.
Yeah, as Isa says, Tsai makes this offhand remark, but doesn't explain what her basis is for thinking either that the novice vows are Baochang's criteria, or that the foundation of the nun's order is dated to that moment, either in that article or in her subsequent translation. In fact, the translation of the text doesn't seem to support the assertion. Broadly speaking, the Lives is uninterested in when women became novices, except when that moment overlaps with the inciting incident for them becoming interested in Buddhism. It also doesn't tackle the problem that novice status for nuns is different in the Vinayas than it is for monks, and the entire point of the first biography is that the monks know this but don't know what the differences are, and it seems to be flatly contradicted by the introduction, where Baochang explicitly states a date range, and that range appears to connect the beginning of the order to Ching-chien's full ordination in 357, not her vows sometime around 317.
We knew all of that when I found the reference in Tai's article. So why was this a problem?
Well, it was a problem because Catherine Tsai never wrote very much. A book review, a couple of articles, and then this translation. So she never tackled this specific issue in print. But according to the footnote in that article, she did look at the problem in her PhD thesis. And getting hold of a copy of that was not straightforward. The closest physical copy to me was 400 miles, and it took a while to work out how to get a PDF. My suspicion was that if I checked the thesis, it wouldn't really say any more than that, but I wasn't happy continuing with the episode without looking at it.
And it was good you did, because it did contain a bunch of stuff on the topic.
Yes, it turned out that this was a great catch by Isa. Tsai had noticed that the Lives was, despite Baochang's gloss, much more ambiguous on the question of who was first than her only published statement on the issue suggested, and Tsai notes that Baochang's opinion was not universally held, nor did it come to dominate the tradition. She quotes a number of later Song texts, which give a much earlier origin in the 1st century, translating the passage as, "Then Emperor Ming of Han allowed the Duke and others to leave the household life. This is the beginning of the monks. The woman, Ah Pan, of Luoyang, and others went forth. This is the beginning of the nuns." Here, I'm in complete agreement with Tsai that is clearly a pious fabrication, unlike the competing claims in the Lives, which probably have historical foundations. But in addition to this competing claim, which the Lives never mentions, and we'll come back to that, there are also attempts in the tradition to integrate the two. One of the much later texts that contains that passage subsequently says, Ah Pan and others received the 3 refuges. The nun, Ching-chien, received ordination from one community, monks only. Hui Guo, Jing-in, and others received ordination from both communities, monks and nuns. These are very late texts, but Tsai notes that they appear to be referencing a text, the Han Fa Banei Zhuan, which was compiled around 520, contemporary with Baoshang, and there is a curiously parallel passage in the life of Ching-chien, which also mentions the nun Ching-chien. Ching-chien doesn't get a biography in the lives, yet she, and not Baoshien or Sengguo or Tailei, is the one in this formula. It's almost impossible to believe that our compiler was unaware of the tradition of Arpan. And Tsai wonders if the compiler was a more astute historian than at times he appears to be, and rejected the stories of early nuns prior to Ching-chien as mere tales. And yes, I think we have to assume some degree of editorial control here. While the compilation does not systematically edit out the messiness or attempt to force it into a standard schema like the later texts do, the Lives does reference far more nuns than it gives biographies for, and at least in some cases it appears that contemporaries would have disagreed with the choices. In her thesis, Tsai recognises this complexity, but is at a loss to explain Bao Chang's decision to give priority to Ching-chien, and writes, Ching-chien became a novice. That is, she took the 10 precepts in 317, and it must be for this reason that she is called the first nun. It's fairly clear in the thesis, unlike the article, that this is a plausible guess rather than the outcome of a careful argument. And we can easily formulate alternative hypotheses. One would be a political agenda. Again, today I really wanted to talk just about the lives, and this is the kind of hypothesis where you would really need to study in relation to other evidence, but nearly a third of the biographies revolve around the dual ordination. If Bao Chang aligned himself with nuns who felt the dual ordination was unnecessary, that the single ordination by the order of monks was perfectly valid, by analogy to Mahaprajapati's foundation of the Indian order, then prioritising Ching-chien's story, which specifically revolves around the validity of that ordination, and the priority of the Vinaya over formal ordination, rather than Mingan and others, makes a lot of sense. Earlier, you might remember I also pointed out that the nuns appear to be organised by when they died. That is not incompatible with this. It makes sense as a system for a compiler, but it also places Ching-chien first. Thus, there is the possibility Bao Shang found it useful because it gave an order he already wanted. Note that this is partly why I have difficulty with Tsai's guess that this is to do with the novice vows. If Bao Shang is using an organising criteria because it suits his purposes, I would expect that criteria to be pretty consistently recorded, and as I noted earlier, the dates on which people died are, novice vows are not. The Lives is a fascinating text. Specialists have used it to draw attention to a wide variety of aspects of Chinese society in the 4th to 6th century. I'm not a Chinese specialist. My interest is a bit broader on the way it reflects on the Buddhist order of nuns in general, and I want to draw attention to one feature which this discussion highlights, which is the tendency for conventional stories of the past to flatten and simplify. If you pick up even a scholarly article on Buddhist nuns in China, it will often simply repeat Bao Shang's gloss that Ching-chien is the first nun. Even the Song period histories, which don't entirely agree with that evaluation, flatten the process into a simple schema, from Arpan to Wei Guo, reflecting a progression through vows, single and double ordination. If we did not have Bao Shang's text, that is all we would be able to see. And if we don't read Bao Shang's text, we miss out on the complexity, the contests that are going on. But complexity and contestation are historical reality, and retellings tend to flatten and obfuscate that. The nuns' order wasn't founded in any single moment, or through the efforts of a single determined woman like Ching-chien, or the auspices of a single learned man like Gunavarman. It was the result of lots of people interacting in a lengthy social process that took decades, perhaps centuries, to play out. As historians, we should be very sensitive to that messiness which lies behind apparently simple statements about who was first.
Like Catherine Tsai's statement in her article, where she actually has a very complicated and nuanced reading of the conflicting claims in her thesis. But because that is unpublished, people tend to read the article or her translation, where the foundation isn't the main point, and she just references her conclusion, which makes it look simpler than it really is.
Exactly. And of course, if we'd not been able to get hold of the thesis, we wouldn't have known how provisional that conclusion was. The same goes with ancient texts. If we didn't have the lives, we couldn't do this, and we'd end up just picking out Arpan's name from those Song period references. We would just have to imagine the messiness behind our sources.
It sounds like you have a case in mind where we just have to imagine the messiness.
Yes, I do, but I think that's a topic for another day. For now, from Issa and myself, thank you for listening.